I'm Gordon Fry. Welcome to our video episode of The History Files. We're filming this in the middle of December of 2016. And what I want to talk about today is the election. It happened a month ago now, and the presidential election of 2016 has been pretty wild and crazy. Seemed like every month I would say, this can't get any crazier, and every month it did. In fact, every week it got crazier. I want to put it into a little bit of perspective. The closest thing I can think of that is similar to the election of 2016 is actually the election of 1860.
And we're talking about the United States here.
Oh yeah, United States. Who knew? I think just about everybody in the world knows about the presidential election of 2016, though. It's been pretty wild and crazy for just about everybody. And the wailing and gnashing of teeth from both sides throughout this campaign has been pretty interesting. And so let's compare it. Let's compare and contrast with the election of 1860. Now, everybody who has any real grasp of history has probably heard of Abraham Lincoln and knows that he was the war president during the American Civil War. What they don't realize is the enormous consternation that was brought forth during the election of 1860. Abraham Lincoln was definitely a dark horse candidate. He was from a brand new political party. It had only been 1860. The first time that the Republican Party ran a presidential candidate was 4 years before, 1856, when they had John C. Fremont run for the presidency, and he, of course, lost spectacularly. But 1860, here's the old Whig Party had collapsed, and the course of the 1850s over abolition of slavery and various other things, but it was replaced kind of sort of by the Republican Party. The Democrats were very strong, but they were also very, very divided. And Lincoln's great opponent in debates, Stephen Douglas, whom the reason that we have presidential debates is because of the Lincoln-Douglas debates, which actually were in 1858 over the Senate run for the Senate position in Illinois. But everybody in the country read those debates in the newspapers, and so Lincoln was fairly well known, but not necessarily well liked. And with Douglas, he was a well-known and generally well-liked politician, the Little Giant. And he was somewhat ambivalent on slavery. He was from Illinois, which was a free state. They did not have slavery in Illinois. Lincoln himself was kind of ambivalent on slavery too, but he was from a party that represented the abolition movement. Lincoln himself was definitely no friend of African American in Illinois and had actively pursued policies to exclude African Americans from Illinois, in fact. But the new political party, the Republican Party, was that of abolition, and that's where Abraham Lincoln chose to set down himself to become a politician. The issue of slavery was huge at the time. It was not the only issue. There was the issue of the tariff. There were just issue of the difference, the cultural differences between the North and the South. And slavery and the tariff issue, which is basically taxes on imports, those were very much a part of the cultural war that was going on between the North and the South, and even within the North and the South, because the manufacturers of the North were for imports, and they also used incredibly cheap immigrant labor for those for their products, and the South was, of course, very agrarian. That's why they had slaves, because, well, it was an agrarian culture, and they did exporting, and so import taxes are bad for exporters because people usually, slap taxes on your exports if you're taxing their exports. The South had economic issues at stake here, not simply slavery. But that was an issue for absolute sure. There was a great moral indignation in the North over slavery. There was moral indignation in the South over the misuse of immigrant labor in the North, though. So there was a lot of issues going on. The problem that the Democratic Party had, and they were united in one thing, they did not want Abraham Lincoln to be elected, but that was the only thing they were united on. And so whereas the Republican Party had one candidate, Abraham Lincoln, the Democratic Party split in three. They had three candidates for the Democratic Party. One was a northerner, Stephen Douglas, who was ambivalent but generally approved of, or at least was not against slavery. Then you had John Breckinridge from Kentucky, who was very much pro-slavery, and then Bell, who was also a Southerner, even more so pro-slavery. And in the course of the election, they split their vote. They split the Democratic vote. And so Abraham Lincoln, with a mere plurality of the vote, he won only 40% of the popular vote, but he won the Electoral College. You can very easily win the Electoral College and only have a plurality of the vote, because that's the way it was set up by the founders, so that a few big cities or a few highly populous areas cannot rule the rest of the country. And that's just the way it was set up. And I think that was a very wise sentiment. In fact, in this election of 2016, there's over 4,000 counties within the United States. I think it's 4,113 or something like that. Hillary Clinton only won 57 of those counties. Okay, that's where the population is, though. So it puts it into a little perspective here. So Abraham Lincoln, one of the most revered presidents in United States history, eventually, only got 40% of the vote. Now, he was also excoriated by the press. They called him a gorilla, an ape. The cartoons were vicious of him. And he had to sneak into Washington for his inauguration in disguise. And of course, the newspapers howled with delight over that. The press was not for Abraham Lincoln. And the Democratic Party in the North was still very, very strong. And so his first few months in office were very difficult. Very difficult. He did not have the backing that was really necessary for the prosecution of this war that in some regards was, you could call his fault, because the South chose his election to be the catalyst for their removal of themselves from the Union. What really got the whole thing going, the war going, though, was when Abraham Lincoln called for 75,000 volunteers from the North to put down the rebellion. And states that had not seceded, like Virginia and Tennessee, said, we're out of here. We're not going to be part of putting down a legal secession on the part of our cousins further south. At any rate, although some people think that this is the end of the world with Donald Trump being elected, maybe not, maybe it is. We don't know what this is a harbinger of. The election of 1860, which was just as wild and crazy as the election of 2016, resulted in the bloodiest war in American history. The next 4 years were horrible. On the other hand, if people keep their wits about them and don't go wild and crazy, it could turn into either a nothing, a big fat nothing, or a renaissance. We don't know. Bottom line is, it's not the first time that this has happened. So, hope you've enjoyed this little tidbit of history, and please join us again another time for a video episode of The History Files.
Cat.
Meow.